There is something deeply unsettling about modern relationships that nobody wants to admit, not because the truth is hidden, but because most people can already feel it. They feel it during those silent, late-night conversations that somehow leave both people feeling even more alone. They feel it while staring at glowing screens beside someone they once believed they could not live without. They feel it when affection slowly transforms into performance, when vulnerability becomes risk, when attention becomes currency, and when love itself starts feeling less like connection and more like negotiation. The strange part is that modern people have never had more ways to communicate, yet they have never struggled this much to feel understood. Never struggled this much to trust. Never struggled this much to stay. People say the world changed because technology evolved, but that is only the surface. The deeper truth is far more uncomfortable. Modern relationships are collapsing under the weight of wounded egos, hidden insecurities, emotional exhaustion, endless comparison, and the terrifying fear of being truly seen. Most people do not know how to love anymore. They know how to impress. They know how to attract. They know how to entertain, but genuine emotional intimacy, that requires something modern culture quietly punishes: stillness, honesty, patience, self-awareness, the ability to sit with another human being without constantly asking, "What am I gaining from this?" And that question, whether spoken or hidden, has poisoned countless relationships because many people no longer enter relationships searching for truth. They enter searching for emotional escape, validation, identity, distraction, protection from loneliness, someone to temporarily silence the chaos inside themselves. But another person cannot permanently heal internal emptiness, and eventually, the performance cracks. Eventually, the masks slip. Eventually, two unfinished people are forced to confront each other without illusion. That is when modern love becomes psychologically dangerous, because most people are not prepared to face another person's shadow, and they are even less prepared to face their own. Carl Jung once said that people do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And nowhere is that darkness more exposed than inside relationships, because relationships are mirrors, not the flattering kind, the brutal kind, the kind that exposes abandonment wounds, control issues, fear of rejection, neediness, ego, jealousy, emotional dependency, resentment, hidden rage, and the terrifying realization that sometimes we do not love people. We love how they make us feel about ourselves. That is the dark truth modern people spend their lives avoiding. And the avoidance begins early. A young man grows up consuming images of perfect relationships, perfect bodies, perfect confidence, perfect chemistry, everything fast, everything exciting, everything cinematic. Nobody teaches him emotional regulation. Nobody teaches him how to communicate pain without anger. Nobody teaches him how to handle rejection without losing himself. Nobody teaches him that attraction alone is not emotional maturity, so he enters relationships carrying invisible hunger. He wants peace, validation, safety, purpose, and, secretly, he wants someone to convince him he is enough. But the problem is that the modern world has trained people to constantly seek stimulation instead of depth, attention instead of understanding, novelty instead of loyalty, and validation instead of self-respect. So even when two people genuinely care about each other, they often sabotage the relationship without realizing it. Not because they are evil, but because they are emotionally fragmented. One person becomes obsessed with reassurance. The other becomes emotionally avoidant. One chases. The other withdraws. One fears abandonment. The other fears losing freedom. And slowly, love turns into psychological warfare disguised as romance. It happens quietly. At first, there are only small signs: a delayed text, a shift in tone, a subtle emotional distance that neither person fully addresses. Then comes overthinking. Silence becomes suspicious. Affection becomes analyzed. People stop listening to each other and start interpreting each other. And interpretation is dangerous, because the human mind does not interpret through truth. It interprets through fear, especially wounded fear That is why modern relationships often feel emotionally exhausting. People are not only interacting with each other, they are interacting with each other's trauma. One sentence can awaken years of insecurity. One moment of distance can reactivate childhood abandonment. One disagreement can trigger buried feelings of worthlessness. And suddenly, two adults are no longer arguing about the present. They are unconsciously reliving emotional histories they barely understand. This is why emotional intelligence matters more than charm, more than status, more than attraction, because attraction can start a relationship. But emotional awareness determines whether it survives reality, and reality always arrives, always. At some point, the excitement fades, the mystery fades, the chemical intoxication fades, and beneath all the romantic projection, two nervous systems finally meet. That is where the real relationship begins. Not during attraction, not during seduction, not during fantasy, but during discomfort, during misunderstanding, during silence, during stress, during disappointment, during the moments where both people discover who the other truly becomes when life is no longer cinematic. Most relationships do not fail because love disappears. They fail because illusion disappears. And many people mistake illusion for love. They fall in love with potential, with fantasy, with emotional intensity, with the version of someone they created inside their own mind. Then reality slowly destroys the fantasy, and resentment begins. You can see it in modern dating culture. People endlessly searching, endlessly comparing, endlessly wondering whether someone better exists one swipe away. The paradox of endless options has created emotional paralysis. People struggle to commit because commitment now feels like limitation. Yet ironically, endless freedom often produces deeper loneliness because human beings were never designed to emotionally connect with infinite possibilities. Connection requires presence, depth, attention, and sacrifice. But sacrifice is unpopular in a culture addicted to convenience. Everyone wants unconditional love. Few want unconditional responsibility. And responsibility is the unglamorous side of intimacy nobody posts online. It is waking up emotionally exhausted and still choosing patience. It is listening when your ego wants to defend itself. It is apologizing without turning the apology into self-protection. It is learning another person's fears without weaponizing them later. That is real intimacy, not intensity, not obsession, not dependency. Modern culture confuses emotional chaos with passion. But chaos is not love. Sometimes chaos is simply two wounded people triggering each other while calling it chemistry. And this is where many men quietly lose themselves, because nobody warns them how psychologically destabilizing modern relationships can become when their identity is built entirely around external validation. A man may appear calm externally, strong, controlled, disciplined, but internally, he becomes emotionally dependent on one person's attention, one person's approval, one person's presence. He starts measuring his worth through her mood, through her affection, through her responsiveness. And without realizing it, he hands over psychological control of his inner state. That is dangerous, not because love is weakness, but because self-abandonment always destroys love. A relationship cannot survive when one person disappears inside it. And modern people disappear constantly. They abandon hobbies, purpose, friendships, identity, boundaries, self-respect, all in exchange for temporary emotional security. Then they wonder why attraction fades. But attraction often dies where authenticity dies. No one truly respects someone who has completely abandoned themselves, not because people are cruel, but because deep down, humans instinctively trust grounded energy. People feel safer around individuals who possess emotional stability, who can stand alone, who are connected to themselves. This is why desperation quietly destroys relationships. Desperation creates pressure, and pressure suffocates connection. You can feel it, the constant need for reassurance, the subtle fear beneath every interaction, the emotional tension hidden behind forced calmness. People sense when someone is terrified of losing them, and, strangely, excessive fear of loss often accelerates the very thing people fear. Because fear changes behavior. It creates emotional clinginess, hypervigilance, control, possessiveness, passive aggression, and emotional exhaustion. This is why inner peace matters in relationships, not because peace makes someone emotionless, but because peace prevents emotional chaos from controlling behavior. Stoic philosophy understood this centuries ago. The Stoics knew that attachment without self-mastery creates suffering, not because attachment itself is wrong, but because uncontrolled attachment turns another human being into emotional oxygen, and nobody can breathe forever under that responsibility. The modern world rarely teaches emotional restraint. Instead, it encourages impulsive expression, react immediately, text immediately, respond emotionally, broadcast every feeling. But emotional maturity is not the absence of emotion. It is the ability to experience emotion without becoming possessed by it. And possession is common in modern relationships. People become possessed by jealousy, possessed by insecurity, possessed by fear, possessed by ego, possessed by the need to win, which is why many couples no longer communicate to understand. They communicate to defend themselves, to control perception, to avoid vulnerability, to protect pride. And pride is one of the quietest killers of intimacy because genuine connection requires emotional exposure. But exposure terrifies modern people, especially those who have been betrayed. There is a unique kind of psychological damage that betrayal creates. Not just heartbreak, distrust, a permanent fracture in perception. After betrayal, people no longer simply experience love. They monitor it, analyze it, prepare for its collapse. They become emotionally defensive, and over time, defensive people struggle to truly connect because vulnerability requires uncertainty. You can't love deeply while trying to emotionally guarantee safety. That is impossible. Love always contains risk. Always. Anyone who promises otherwise is selling fantasy. To emotionally connect with another person means accepting the possibility of pain, loss, disappointment, misunderstanding, grief. And that reality terrifies modern people who were taught that discomfort is failure. But discomfort is not failure. Sometimes discomfort is intimacy revealing truth. Sometimes it reveals emotional incompatibility. Sometimes it reveals unresolved trauma. Sometimes it reveals hidden resentment. And sometimes it reveals that two people were never truly connected, only attached. There is a difference. Attachment says, "Do not leave me because I need you to feel complete." Love says, "I care for you deeply, but I do not seek to own your soul." Modern relationships often confuse possession with devotion. People become obsessed with controlling outcomes, who someone follows, who they text, where they go, how quickly they respond. And beneath all that control is usually the same hidden fear. I am afraid I am not enough. That fear silently shapes countless relationships. And social media has amplified it beyond anything previous generations experienced, because now comparison never ends. There is always someone more attractive, more successful, more exciting, more confident, more admired. People no longer compare themselves only to neighbors or coworkers. They compare themselves to curated illusions from millions of strangers. That psychological pressure slowly poisons self-worth, and low self-worth inevitably distorts relationships. Because insecure people often seek relationships not to share love, but to escape self-hatred. That creates dangerous dependency. A relationship becomes emotional medication, and medication loses power when tolerance develops. Eventually, reassurance stops working, attention stops satisfying, validation stops healing, because external love cannot permanently repair internal emptiness. The emptiness always returns, usually stronger. That is why some people become addicted to new relationships, not because they are evil, but because novelty temporarily numbs unresolved pain. New attention creates emotional dopamine. New attraction creates fantasy. New chemistry creates temporary escape. But eventually, reality arrives again, and the cycle repeats. This is why modern dating often feels emotionally disposable. People replace connection before understanding it. They leave conversations the moment discomfort appears. They avoid emotional depth because depth exposes wounds. And wounded people often fear introspection more than loneliness. Because loneliness at least feels familiar, self-awareness changes everything, and change is frightening, especially when someone realizes they have spent years repeating the same emotional patterns, choosing emotionally unavailable people, avoiding vulnerability, seeking validation, mistaking intensity for intimacy, sabotaging healthy connection because chaos feels emotionally normal. Human beings often recreate familiar suffering, even when that suffering destroys them. Nietzsche understood something terrifying about human nature. He understood that many people would rather cling to familiar pain than confront the uncertainty of transformation. That applies directly to relationships. Some people stay inside emotional dysfunction because dysfunction feels psychologically recognizable. A man raised around emotional instability may unconsciously feel uncomfortable inside peaceful love. A woman raised around emotional inconsistency may mistake unpredictability for passion. And without awareness, people repeat emotional histories disguised as romantic choices. This is why healing matters, not the superficial version sold online, not performative self-care. Real healing, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that forces someone to confront their own shadow, their ego, their manipulative tendencies, their avoidance, their fear of intimacy, their fear of abandonment, their inability to regulate emotion, their need for control. Because every unresolved wound eventually enters relationships. Nothing stays buried forever. Especially emotional pain. Pain always leaks through behavior, through tone, through silence, through defensiveness, through withdrawal, through passive aggression, through emotional unpredictability. People often say communication is the key to relationships, but communication without self-awareness becomes noise. Someone can speak constantly and still never reveal the truth, because truth requires honesty with oneself first. And many people spend years emotionally lying to themselves, pretending they are okay, pretending they are detached, pretending they do not care, pretending they are healed, until one relationship exposes everything they tried to suppress. That is what intimate relationships do. They expose emotional reality. No matter how controlled someone appears publicly, no matter how disciplined, no matter how intelligent, relationships bypass intellectual defenses. They reach the nervous system, the subconscious, the wounded child hidden beneath adult identity, and suddenly someone who seemed emotionally composed becomes irrational, reactive, fearful, obsessive, not because love made them weak, but because intimacy exposed unresolved pain. That is why emotional self-control is one of the most underrated forms of strength. Not emotional suppression. Control, there is a difference. Suppression buries emotion. Control understands emotion without obeying it blindly. A mature man can feel jealousy without becoming controlling. He can feel anger without becoming destructive. He can feel sadness without collapsing into self-pity. He can feel heartbreak without losing dignity. That level of self-awareness is rare because modern culture rewards emotional extremes, outrage, drama, impulsiveness, public emotional display. Stillness has become almost revolutionary, especially in relationships. There is enormous psychological power in someone who remains grounded while emotionally challenged, not cold. Grounded, because grounded people do not seek emotional domination. They seek clarity, and clarity changes relationships completely. A clear person notices manipulation early, not just manipulation from others, their own manipulation too. That is another dark truth few people discuss. Most humans manipulate emotionally at times. Not always maliciously, sometimes unconsciously, through guilt, withdrawal, victimhood, silence, approval, affection, distance. People learn these patterns through survival, especially if they grew up in emotionally unstable environments. A child quickly learns what behavior earns attention, what behavior avoids conflict, what behavior creates safety. Then those survival patterns quietly follow them into adult relationships, and unless they become conscious, they continue repeating automatically. This is why shadow psychology matters, not because humans are monsters, but because unconscious behavior controls most people far more than they realize. Jung believed that what remains unconscious eventually directs behavior, while people call it fate. Modern relationships prove this constantly. People repeat patterns they swear they hate. They attract dynamics they promise themselves they would avoid. They sabotage healthy connection while craving stability. And the reason is often hidden beneath conscious awareness. The mind protects familiar identity, even painful identity. If someone secretly believes they are unworthy of love, they may unconsciously destroy relationships that contradict that belief. If someone secretly fears intimacy, they may chase unavailable people because unavailable love feels emotionally safer than real vulnerability. The human psyche is complicated, far more complicated than social media advice makes it seem. There are no simple formulas, no perfect communication technique, no universal dating strategy, because relationships are not mathematical. They are psychological, emotional, spiritual, and deeply influenced by unconscious fears. This is why modern people feel exhausted. They are trying to navigate intimacy while disconnected from themselves, trying to receive love while secretly feeling inadequate, trying to trust while expecting betrayal, trying to appear strong while emotionally starving for reassurance. And underneath it all is loneliness. Not ordinary loneliness, existential loneliness, the kind that appears even in crowded rooms, even beside another person, because physical presence does not guarantee emotional connection. Some couples sleep beside each other every night while remaining psychologically worlds apart. No real vulnerability, no emotional honesty, only routines, responsibilities, and silent emotional distance. That kind of loneliness is devastating because it slowly erodes the soul. Humans are not destroyed only by heartbreak. Sometimes they are destroyed by emotional starvation inside relationships that continue existing physically. This is why emotional neglect can feel more painful than open conflict. Conflict at least acknowledges emotional existence. Neglect creates invisibility, and invisibility wounds people deeply, especially men, because many men are conditioned to suppress emotional needs, to remain stoic externally while silently carrying emotional weight alone. But suppressed emotion does not disappear. It transforms. Sometimes into anger, sometimes into numbness, sometimes into addiction, sometimes into quiet depression nobody notices. There are men walking through life appearing functional while emotionally disconnected from themselves entirely. They work, provide, smile, perform, but internally they feel hollow, not because they lack strength, but because they have spent years denying emotional reality. Modern relationships often intensify this conflict. Men are expected to remain emotionally available, but never emotionally unstable, sensitive but not weak, confident but not arrogant, protective but never controlling, successful but emotionally present. The psychological pressure becomes enormous, and many men silently collapse under it. Not publicly, internally, quietly. A man may sit in his car after an argument staring through the windshield in complete silence, not because he has nothing to say, but because he no longer knows how to explain the exhaustion inside him. The exhaustion of constantly performing emotional strength, the exhaustion of suppressing fear, the exhaustion of feeling replaceable in a world obsessed with endless options. And beneath that exhaustion is often a painful question. If I stop performing, would anyone still stay? That question haunts modern relationships because many people fear that they are loved conditionally, loved for usefulness, appearance, status, emotional labor, entertainment, stability, but not genuinely loved for who they are beneath performance. And perhaps the darkest truth is that many relationships are partially conditional, not entirely, but partially. Humans are not purely selfless creatures. Needs exist, preferences exist, expectations exist. The problem begins when relationships become entirely transactional, when affection becomes reward, when vulnerability becomes leverage, when love becomes negotiation. At that point, intimacy dies. Because genuine connection cannot survive constant psychological calculation. People crave authenticity, even if they struggle to offer it themselves. That is why truly authentic individuals leave such powerful emotional impact. Someone who speaks honestly, who communicates directly, who does not play emotional games, who remains calm under pressure, who does not manipulate attention. That energy feels rare now, almost foreign, because modern dating culture often rewards emotional performance over emotional truth. People carefully curate identities, craft responses, measure timing, hide vulnerability, pretend indifference. Everything becomes strategy. And strategy eventually destroys spontaneity. It destroys emotional safety, because genuine intimacy cannot bloom where people constantly protect image. To love deeply requires the courage to be psychologically visible, and visibility is terrifying, especially after disappointment, after betrayal, after humiliation, after rejection. Many people become emotionally armored. They convince themselves they no longer care. That attachment is weakness. That emotional detachment equals strength. But complete emotional detachment is not strength. Often it is unprocessed pain disguised as independence. Real strength is remaining emotionally open without losing self-respect. That balance is rare because modern people tend to swing between extremes: emotional dependency or emotional avoidance, obsession or detachment, clinginess or isolation. Very few people know how to love with both depth and emotional stability. And yet, that is exactly what healthy relationships require: depth without possession, freedom without neglect, vulnerability without self-erasure, love without psychological domination. Simple to describe, difficult to live. Especially in a culture constantly stimulating insecurity, a culture that profits from comparison, from loneliness, from emotional dissatisfaction. People consume endless content teaching attraction, but almost nothing teaching emotional responsibility. And responsibility is the hidden foundation of lasting connection, not romantic excitement. Excitement fades naturally. Responsibility keeps people conscious during difficult seasons. It keeps them honest, patient, respectful, even when emotions fluctuate. Because emotions always fluctuate. That is another modern illusion. The belief that real love should feel intense constantly. It should not. No emotional state remains permanent. Human psychology does not work that way. Relationships contain cycles. Closeness, distance, passion, calm, conflict, repair. The problem is that modern people often panic the moment emotional intensity decreases. They interpret calmness as failure, but peace is not failure. Peace is unfamiliar to nervous systems addicted to chaos. A healthy relationship may initially feel boring to someone conditioned by emotional instability, because the body becomes accustomed to emotional highs and lows. Adrenaline, anxiety, uncertainty. That unpredictability can create addictive chemistry, not healthy connection. Addictive chemistry, there is a difference, and confusing those two destroys countless people. Someone may spend years chasing emotional intensity while unknowingly avoiding true intimacy. Because intimacy requires consistency, honesty, patience, and emotional accountability, things the ego often resists, especially when accountability threatens identity. A person who sees themselves as the good one struggles to admit manipulative behavior. A person who sees themselves as independent struggles to admit fear of abandonment. A person who sees themselves as emotionally strong struggles to admit vulnerability. Yet those admissions are necessary. Without them, relationships become theaters of denial. Two people pretending, projecting, defending, avoiding, and slowly emotionally starving each other while maintaining appearances. That quiet emotional starvation is becoming increasingly common. You can feel it in modern conversations. People speak constantly, yet rarely reveal anything real. Everything filtered, curated, polished. Even vulnerability sometimes becomes performance. People share pain selectively to gain validation rather than genuine connection. And over time, sincerity becomes difficult to recognize. Trust erodes, suspicion grows. People begin assuming hidden motives everywhere, which creates another tragedy. Truly good people become harder to trust because deception has become so normalized. This emotional climate creates defensive relationships. People enter already guarded, already cautious, already expecting disappointment. An expectation shapes perception. Someone expecting betrayal notices every ambiguous signal, every delayed response, every slight emotional shift. The nervous system remains alert constantly. That hypervigilance slowly destroys peace, not because danger is always present, but because the mind has become conditioned to anticipate pain. Many people are not living in relationships. They are surviving them, monitoring, managing, analyzing, protecting themselves emotionally every second. That is exhausting. And eventually, exhaustion changes personality. A warm person becomes distant. A trusting person becomes suspicious. A vulnerable person becomes emotionally numb. People do not become cold overnight. Usually, they become cold gradually after repeated disappointment. That is why compassion matters, because everyone carries invisible emotional history. The calm woman who struggles to express affection may have spent years feeling emotionally unsafe. The distant man who avoids vulnerability may have learned early that emotional exposure invites humiliation. People adapt psychologically to survive experiences. Then later, those survival adaptations create relational problems. The irony is painful. The behaviors that once protected someone often become the very behaviors that isolate them later. Avoidance prevents vulnerability. Control prevents trust. Emotional walls prevent intimacy. Yet lowering those defenses feels terrifying because the nervous system remembers pain, and memory shapes behavior more than logic. This is why relationships cannot be understood purely intellectually. You cannot logic your way through emotional wounds. Awareness helps, but healing also requires emotional experience, safe experience, corrective experience, moments where someone slowly learns that vulnerability does not always lead to destruction, that honesty does not always create abandonment, that emotional expression does not always result in shame, but building that safety takes time, and modern culture hates slowness. Everything must happen instantly. Instant attraction, instant chemistry, instant certainty, instant emotional gratification. But deep trust develops slowly, like roots underground. Invisible at first, quiet, unimpressive, yet essential. Modern people often abandon relationships before emotional roots fully develop. The moment discomfort appears, they flee. Sometimes leaving is necessary. Some relationships are genuinely destructive, but many modern people also leave simply because they encounter emotional complexity they were never taught how to navigate. Conflict becomes catastrophe, imperfection becomes incompatibility, human weakness becomes disqualification, and slowly relationships become increasingly fragile, disposable, temporary, emotionally shallow. This creates a terrifying contradiction. People desperately crave deep connection while simultaneously avoiding the vulnerability required to create it. They want intimacy without risk, loyalty without sacrifice, love without discomfort. But real connection demands psychological exposure. And exposure always feels dangerous, especially in a culture where emotional wounds are hidden behind curated identities. There is also another uncomfortable truth few people discuss openly. Many relationships are built on unconscious power dynamics. Who cares less? Who needs more? Who withdraws? Who chases? Who controls emotional access? People often deny this because it sounds cynical, but emotional power exists, and when relationships become unstable, people feel that imbalance intensely. The one more emotionally dependent usually suffers more, because dependency creates vulnerability. This is why self-respect matters so deeply, not ego, self-respect. A grounded person can love deeply without abandoning dignity, without tolerating manipulation endlessly, without losing identity, without sacrificing psychological stability for temporary affection. That kind of inner stability changes relationships completely, because emotionally stable people are harder to control, harder to manipulate, harder to destabilize, not because they care less, but because they are connected to themselves. And connection to self creates emotional resilience. Modern relationships desperately need that resilience, because contemporary life constantly attacks emotional attention, notifications, comparison, stress, economic pressure, isolation, information overload. Humans were never psychologically designed for this level of stimulation, and overstimulated minds struggle to remain emotionally present. Presence is becoming rare. Real presence, not physical proximity. Psychological presence, listening fully, seeing another person clearly, sharing silence without distraction. Modern people often experience relationships while mentally elsewhere, thinking about work, social media, past resentment, future anxiety. And over time, emotional connection weakens from simple neglect, not dramatic betrayal, neglect. Small moments of disconnection repeated daily. That is how many relationships die. Quietly, not through explosions, through erosion, a lack of attention, a lack of appreciation, a lack of emotional presence. People assume love disappears suddenly. Usually it fades slowly through accumulated emotional distance. One ignored conversation, one unresolved resentment, one emotionally absent evening after another, until eventually strangers are sleeping beside each other. And perhaps the most painful part is that many people do not realize what they lost until emotional disconnection becomes irreversible. Then comes regret. And regret inside relationships is uniquely haunting, because unlike random life mistakes, relationship regret often involves realizing you failed someone who genuinely loved you, or realizing someone failed you while you kept hoping they would change. Hope can be psychologically dangerous, especially when mixed with loneliness. People tolerate extraordinary emotional pain because they are attached to potential, to memories, to who someone used to be, or who they imagined they could become. That attachment can trap people inside emotionally draining relationships for years, waiting, explaining, forgiving, sacrificing, until one day they look in the mirror and barely recognize themselves anymore. That is one of the darkest consequences of unhealthy relationships. Identity erosion, slow psychological disappearance. People lose their confidence, their joy, their emotional energy, their connection to purpose, all while trying desperately to save something already collapsing. And still, humans continue seeking love, despite heartbreak, despite betrayal, despite disappointment, because somewhere beneath all the dysfunction, the desire for connection remains deeply human. People want to be understood, seen, accepted, chosen, not for performance, not for utility, but authentically. That desire will never disappear, no matter how cynical the world becomes. And perhaps that is the beautiful contradiction hidden inside this dark reality. Even wounded people continue searching for love. Even emotionally exhausted people continue hoping. Even after disappointment, the human heart quietly remains open somewhere beneath the armor. But hope alone is not enough. Without self-awareness, people repeat suffering. Without emotional responsibility, relationships become destructive. Without inner stability, love becomes dependency. And without honesty, intimacy becomes impossible. The dark truth about modern relationships is not that love no longer exists. It does. The dark truth is that many people are psychologically unprepared for the emotional depth real love demands. Real love forces confrontation with ego, with fear, with insecurity, with attachment, with emotional wounds, with identity itself. Because eventually every relationship asks the same terrifying question. Can you remain emotionally honest when illusion disappears? Can you still communicate when attraction fluctuates? Can you stay grounded when fear awakens? Can you love another person without abandoning yourself? Very few people can answer those questions consciously. Most react unconsciously instead, and unconscious reactions create suffering. That suffering then spreads generationally. Children observe emotionally unstable relationships. They absorb silence, conflict, manipulation, distance, then unknowingly repeat those patterns later. This is why emotionally mature relationships matter far beyond romance. They shape human psychology itself. A child raised around emotional safety develops differently from one raised around instability. A person loved consistently learns trust differently from someone loved conditionally. Relationships leave psychological fingerprints, sometimes for life, which is why choosing who enters your inner world matters profoundly. Not everyone deserves psychological access to you. Not everyone deserves emotional influence over your nervous system. Modern people underestimate this constantly. They allow emotionally chaotic individuals into intimate spaces, then wonder why peace disappears. Energy matters. Behavior matters. Character matters. And attraction alone is never enough. Never. Chemistry without emotional maturity eventually becomes destruction. A relationship cannot survive on attraction if both people lack self-awareness. Eventually, ego consumes connection. Eventually, fear consumes trust. Eventually, resentment consumes affection. unless both people consciously work against those forces, because relationships are not sustained automatically. They require intentionality, not obsession. Intentionality. There is a quiet discipline to healthy love, the discipline of listening, of regulating emotion, of communicating honestly, of maintaining self-respect, of remaining compassionate during conflict, of protecting connection without controlling each other. That discipline rarely appears dramatic online, but it is psychologically profound. And perhaps that is why modern relationships struggle so deeply. Modern culture worships intensity, but sustainable love is often quiet, steady, grounded, intentional. It lacks the chaotic excitement many people unconsciously associate with romance. Yet, paradoxically, it creates the deepest form of peace. And peace is something many modern people secretly crave more than excitement, because exhaustion eventually changes priorities. After enough emotional chaos, peace becomes attractive. Clarity becomes attractive. Consistency becomes attractive. Emotional safety becomes attractive. A person who communicates honestly becomes attractive. A person who remains emotionally stable during conflict becomes attractive, not flashy, not performative, simply emotionally mature. That maturity is becoming increasingly rare, which is exactly why it feels so powerful when encountered. Imagine two people sitting together late at night. No performance, no manipulation, no emotional games, just honesty. The kind of honesty that allows silence to feel safe instead of threatening. The kind of honesty where neither person needs to constantly manage image. That kind of connection heals something deep inside the human psyche, because beneath all the ego and fear, humans are exhausted from pretending, exhausted from performing strength, performing happiness, performing detachment, performing perfection. People want somewhere they can finally be psychologically real. That is why authentic love feels almost spiritual, not because it removes suffering, but because it removes masks. And masks are heavy, very heavy, especially over time. A person can spend years pretending to be emotionally unaffected while silently falling apart internally. A person can spend years appearing confident while secretly terrified of abandonment. A person can spend years seeking validation through relationships because they never learned how to value themselves alone. Eventually, all those performances collapse. And when they collapse inside relationships, truth emerges, sometimes painful truth. But truth nevertheless, and truth is necessary because illusion cannot sustain intimacy forever. Eventually, reality enters every relationship. Bills, stress, loss, failure, aging, disappointment, emotional fatigue. Real life strips fantasy away. Then people discover whether the relationship was built on substance or stimulation, whether there is genuine emotional respect beneath attraction, whether both people can navigate discomfort without psychological destruction, whether love exists beyond idealized fantasy. Many relationships fail this test, not because the people are evil, but because emotional maturity requires conscious effort most people were never taught. And perhaps that realization should create compassion rather than judgment. Humans are emotionally complicated creatures trying to love while carrying invisible wounds, trying to trust while fearing betrayal, trying to connect while protecting themselves, trying to remain hopeful in a culture that often reduces intimacy to entertainment. That struggle is real, but awareness changes everything. The moment someone becomes conscious of their patterns, transformation becomes possible. Not easy, possible. A man who recognizes his fear of abandonment can stop confusing reassurance with love. A woman who recognizes her attraction to emotional chaos can stop mistaking instability for passion. A person who recognizes their manipulative tendencies can begin communicating honestly. Instead, self-awareness interrupts unconscious cycles. And unconscious cycles are what trap most people. That is why solitude can be psychologically important, not isolation. Solitude. There is a difference. Isolation disconnects. Solitude reveals. In solitude, people encounter themselves without distraction, without romantic fantasy, without emotional performance, without constant validation. And that encounter can feel terrifying because many people discover they do not actually know themselves. They know their social identity, their relationship identity, their online identity. But beneath all that, Silence reveals unresolved emptiness, yet that emptiness is not punishment. It is invitation to build a relationship with oneself. Because people who cannot emotionally sit with themselves often expect relationships to rescue them from themselves. That burden eventually crushes intimacy. No partner can permanently stabilize someone who refuses to face their own inner chaos. At some point, every individual must confront themselves honestly, their fears, their wounds, their insecurities, their emotional habits, their shadow. Without that confrontation, relationships become unconscious attempts to escape internal discomfort. And escape never creates peace, only temporary distraction. This is why emotionally healthy relationships often begin with individual self-awareness, not perfection. Awareness, the willingness to recognize personal responsibility, to communicate clearly, to regulate emotion, to maintain identity while loving deeply, to avoid turning another human being into emotional salvation. That kind of love is powerful because it is rooted in freedom rather than fear. Two emotionally grounded individuals choosing connection consciously, not desperately, not manipulatively, consciously. And perhaps that is the final truth modern culture rarely discusses. Love alone is not enough. Without character, love collapses. Without discipline, love collapses. Without honesty, love collapses. Without self-awareness, love collapses. Because relationships magnify whatever already exists inside people. If someone carries unresolved chaos internally, intimacy amplifies it. If someone carries peace internally, intimacy amplifies that too. Relationships are mirrors, and mirrors reveal reality whether people are ready or not. That is why modern relationships feel so emotionally intense. They force confrontation with parts of ourselves we spend most of life avoiding. Neediness, fear, control, ego, loneliness, dependency, shame, the desire to be chosen, the terror of rejection, the ache of emotional invisibility. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that many people never fully confront these truths. They move from relationship to relationship, repeating the same emotional patterns under different names, different faces, different cities, different conversations, but the same unresolved psychology. Until eventually exhaustion sets in, not just heartbreak, existential exhaustion. The exhaustion of pretending, the exhaustion of chasing validation, the exhaustion of emotional instability, the exhaustion of constantly seeking externally what was never built internally. And somewhere inside that exhaustion, wisdom can emerge. A quieter kind of wisdom, one that no longer seeks relationships purely for excitement, but for peace, truth, mutual growth, emotional safety, real companionship, because at the end of the day, human beings do not merely want attention, they want understanding, not shallow fascination, understanding, to be seen clearly without performance, to be accepted without constant emotional negotiation, to sit beside another person without fear of emotional manipulation. That desire remains timeless. Even in a modern world increasingly disconnected from itself. And maybe that is why the deepest relationships still feel sacred, because genuine connection reminds people of something the modern world constantly makes them forget. That beneath all the ego, fear, status, comparison, and distraction, humans are fragile creatures longing for meaning, longing for emotional home, longing for someone who does not merely consume their presence, but truly understands their soul. But such connection demands courage, the courage to confront oneself, the courage to communicate honestly, the courage to remain emotionally grounded in a culture addicted to chaos, the courage to love without losing identity, the courage to leave relationships that destroy peace, and the courage to stop expecting another person to heal wounds only self-awareness can address. That is the dark truth about modern relationships. Not that love is dead, but that genuine love now requires extraordinary emotional maturity in a psychologically fragmented world. And perhaps those who finally understand this stop chasing intensity. They stop worshiping validation. They stop romanticizing emotional chaos. Instead, they begin valuing something quieter, something deeper, presence, integrity, calmness, truth. Because after enough emotional noise, truth becomes beautiful. And maybe the strongest relationships are not the loudest ones. Maybe they are the quiet connections where two people no longer need to constantly prove their worth. Where silence feels safe, where honesty feels natural, where vulnerability is not punished, where love is no longer performance, just presence. And in a world drowning in distraction, manipulation, ego, and emotional confusion, perhaps genuine presence has become the rarest form of intimacy left.